Hi, I'm Kent.
And I'm Anna.
We're married, we make movies, and we believe that anyone in any circumstance can make a feature film.
Welcome to the Feature Filmmaker Podcast. If you want a career making movies, you're in the right place.
Hit subscribe to never miss an episode.
Let's jump right in. Hi, welcome to the podcast today. We're going to start by talking about creating character and what that means. So Kent and I had a discussion as we were on a walk with the family today about how do you develop a character, and that there are so many things that come into play with characters. There's their history, their reactions to the things around them, their occupations, their passions, their relationships. There's so many ways that you can develop a character, but we want to talk about what that really is, because in a way, all of those things are kind of external, and character might be something deeper than that. Just like in art, if you're drawing a person, you have to understand how bone structure works to be able to draw the figure accurately, but you're not going to actually see the bones necessarily in the finished product. And so there's something to that with character development as well that we want to get into.
Yeah, so welcome to Huddleston Pond. It's a little pond a little ways from our house, and if you close your eyes, you'll join us on our conversation as we wrangle children and walk around a cloudy day, and there are ducks and a lot of bird poop on the ground. And Anna and I are troubleshooting a script that Anna's currently writing and talking about character and why do certain characters decide to do something, and how do you motivate that, and what makes a character change. And these are sort of the things we were talking about. And so we've had some thoughts about that, and like Anna talked about, this sort of, I don't know, metaphorical way of thinking about it. We talked about there's all these ways that we can reveal character, but what is character?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so that's like the bones. There's like this idea that there's bones underneath flesh, you know, but we never really see that. Like a movie is incapable of showing that, you know, for what it truly, truly is. But it can show all sorts of things to suggest to the audience, to give them an idea of what that is. And so I guess I'll start by asking, what, Anna, would you say is character?
I was just going to ask you that.
I beat you to it.
Do you have ideas already?
No, if you asked me, my brain would immediately start searching for it, but I'm going to make you do the work first.
I mean, I think character is largely determined by our reactions to the circumstances around us, how we choose to react internally with our thoughts, feelings, and then eventually the actions that are manifest on screen. And so it's something that is not so black and white or simple as to say, oh, well, you know, in all of these types of situations, this character reacts angrily. And in these other situations, the character reacts happily. I think that it's a very hard thing to put your finger on, but essentially it's the patterns in the ways we respond to the things around us.
So there's maybe patterns. That's an interesting idea. You know, it makes me think of Robert McKee, who wrote a book called Story. And I remember one thing that stuck with me from when I read that years ago. I was in high school, actually. I grabbed a copy of it off of like a Barnes & Noble bookshelf, I think. He said that a lot of novice writers, or not novice writers for that matter, will be like trying to create more character in a character, you know? And he says that what they'll do is they'll say, oh, he was in prison and he's dashingly handsome, but now he's out of prison. He's reformed his ways and he plays the saxophone, and he, you know, and they just keep like throwing stuff, you know, information on this person as if that's going to like somehow flesh out the character, you know? And he said, this is characterization, and we need to understand the delineation between character and characterization. And so characterization are like attributes, talents, or skills or information about a character and maybe I need to go back and reread Story, but I don't remember him ever actually like clearly defining what character itself is. And I think most people in like casual conversation would say something similar to what you were alluding to, Anna, which is character is like what we do. You know, even Robert McKee actually, that's basically what he said. Is he said we define character by showing what someone does in a high stress situation.
Hmm.
And so he talks about why we have stories that put a lot of pressure on a character, because what they choose to do when the pressure is really high reveals who they are. And you know, that's reminds me of C.S. Lewis, who said circumstances do not make the man, they reveal him to himself.
Hmm.
So there's a lot there. I think these are different people trying to express what is character, which is such an ethereal, it's almost a concept.
Yeah, I like where you're going with that. Like, that in a high stress situation, how do you respond? But I also think character is, how do you respond when you're really happy? Like, how do you respond in all sorts of situations when you're getting to know someone, when you're dating, for example? You want to see that
You
person.
could argue that that's high stress.
Well, sometimes, but you want to see that person in a variety of circumstances. And I remember my mom telling me this, like, what is, see what that person is like when they're angry, see what they're like when they're stressed, see what they're like when they're happy, and kind of,
Or when they're with their family or with kids.
yeah, exactly. And that gives you a well-rounded view of that person's character. And so maybe that could be useful in character development for me to say, how does this character act around these kinds of people or in these kinds of situations, and just take some common ones, like for sure you want to know how they act when they're tired, when they're stressed, when they're angry. Those are common.
You know, and something that you were making me think of, what is that word that starts with an L that's when you're falling in love with someone?
Limerent.
Limerence. Yeah, you were reading about how like limerence is the word that describes the state that we're in when we're falling in love with someone. So it's that state where we only see the good. And so even when you do put them in all those circumstances, it's like, of course, we're going to be on our best behavior when we're like dating someone and we're around kids. We're going to be like the sweetest we can be around kids. Or when we first meet their mom, we're going to try and make the best impression we can, right? And even if we don't do a great job of it, the other person's probably going to be like, you just see past it anyway. I bring that up because I feel like there's sort of an anti-limerence, I'm sure there's a word for it, that audiences experience in films when they're watching a movie. And I feel like it's actually interesting because I feel like we were talking about this earlier this week, Anna, where we feel like when we're honest, when we say, no, this is kind of realistic, what we think that maybe even this is what I would do in these circumstances when I would get frustrated with my kids or when I would do this thing. We've done this in a lot of scripts where we're like, well, but this is a realistic behavior. And then people read it and they say, we hate this character. And we're like, that hurts my feelings because I feel like this is really a reflection of myself and it feels very realistic. And I think most of us have lost our tempers horribly with our own children and behaved in ways that we would feel so embarrassed about if we could see that played back for us the same way we would feel as if we could see our childhood tantrums. And then that's not a justification, but I do think that it's common in the sense that we're all trying. And yet we'll show, we'll show scripts to people. And what we realized was that even if we're being honest or realistic, there's like an anti-limerence, like it's like a high amount of judgment towards characters. We really want people who are going to be a little more heroic. But I mean, maybe that's tangential, but like what makes someone root for a character? Because ironically, I remember on the page when you read the script for example, Toy Story, the first one from 95, Woody he reads like an all out jerk. And no one cares when they watch that movie. Man, the beginning of that movie, he's sabotaging, he's selfish, he's insecure, he's judgmental, he's scared that Buzz is going to take his spot as like the big cheese, and he's kind of awful, and yet he has some charisma and he is a good leader, and Buzz is kind of a dope anyway. It's like you kind of are rooting for him to get rid of this weird space toy. And yet, like he kind of deserves everything he gets. He does a lot of things pretty selfishly. And so what is it that makes Woody someone we root for? And what is it that makes some characters, maybe not as well written by people like, I don't know, me, hard to root for, even if they're quote unquote realistic, you know? And and what does that have to say about this discussion we're having about the definition of character? And not just the definition, but the podcast, I hope, is, leads to how do we create character or how do we communicate character?
Yeah. I mean, what comes to my mind is the simple definition of a story that it's someone who's trying to do something and having a hard time. What is it? Trying to who wants something badly and is having a hard time getting it. Said it wrong and then messed it up.
Just keep trying. It's hard, but you'll get it.
And I think that basic premise is so relatable to me. Everyone knows what it's like to want something badly and have a hard time getting it. And so I think that characters where it's very clear that they have an objective, they really want to win over the girl, or they really want, to figure out their career. I don't know, whatever. They really want something, and I think if we can lock into that, that helps me relate to characters. I think that it's hard to relate to them when they feel passive. They feel like they're just kind of reacting.
Hmm. Well, that's true. And if a character isn't wanting and taking action toward something, it's true that we sort of, how can we root for them? What are we rooting for?
What?
Yeah. And so, and it's, I mean, I push back on myself, right? I'm talking about this from the place of like audience engagement, to help them participate in the story. But ultimately, like, it's not like the objective has to be that we root for the protagonist. I'm leaving space open for that because that's not the ends. That's usually a means. It's a means for engaging and helping encourage audience participation. But it's true. How are they going to care about a character if the character doesn't care about anything, Someone might be able to answer that. Maybe if I gave it enough thought, I could think of an exception. But for the most part, it's a question that I think leads us to a decently universal conclusion in the writing world, which is that it's hard. It's easier to not push a character, but write a character that wants something deeply. And usually that requires some vulnerability on the part of the writer, I think. We usually have to think about, like, it doesn't have to be personal. Like, what do I want? But that often works well, coming from a place of desire. But
I think that the character also needs to have an arc, right? So they have to change somehow. In the end, it really doesn't matter if they get what they want or not, as long as they become who they need to be. And so we need to get a sense of where they're falling short, how they overcome that or change. And I think that makes for characters that are, I don't know, that feel good.
Feel good. For some reason, what's coming to my mind, I mean, and you can plug in whatever movie you want. You can do this all day, right? But for some reason, I think a beautiful example of this is the protagonist in the film's The Sound of Metal. He is such an exquisite example of a character's wants, which are desperately intense, versus a character which are significant, right? And so he's experiencing these wants a lot. Basically, he loses his hearing and he's a drummer and his world is gone. It's like falling apart. And it feels like his whole world is ripped away from him, which is a standard first act in traditional Western 3-act structure screenwriting, storytelling for that matter. And so now it's evident that when his girlfriend leaves him to be in this home for the deaf, where he's basically going to go through some sort of a rehabilitation of some kind. He's going to learn ASL and form relationships and whatever. His whole mission is to get his hearing back so that he can get his life back. That's it. That is the bottom line. And the only way he can see to do that is to like scrape enough money together to get this operation, which is really expensive, to restore some sense of his hearing so that he doesn't have to communicate with people through ASL. And the end of that movie kind of, I don't know, without spoiling it, I really want to encourage people to watch that film. It's really wonderful. But there's this sort of like total loss, and there's a sense of his needing, what he wants is his hearing back. He wants his old life back, but what he needs is to basically look forward to a new life and find some sense of peace, like let go of this yearning desire and embrace the silence, literal silence in this case. And it's actually a significantly spiritual film, in my opinion, by the end. That character feels well written to me. And he's pretty simple. You imagine a musician who loses his hearing and how, you know, earth-shattering that is. And this is often the case, right? We think about what's the worst possible thing that could happen to this character. Do that to them, you know? We talk about that, I feel like, a lot in screenwriting, right? It's not like I'm the first person to say this. But why is that? Because that will plunge them into a fit of wanting something badly. You know, it's like that will put them in a situation of deep strain and desire, and it's going to cause their character to kind of spill out through all these reactions and actions and words and deeds and the paths they choose to take, and all the changes that ensue in their life are going to kind of reveal that, not just to themselves, as C.S. Lewis said, but to the audience.
Well, in a way, that's true for everyone. I think we all have to change through a series of rebirths, where you have to let go of who you were to become someone new. And so that entails a loss of some sort, or a sacrifice, or a letting go in order to become something new. And so it makes sense that that would be a catalyst for change.
It's really thoughtful. I wonder about how Christ talks about needing to become like a little child, and why children have such an ability to let go of things and forgive people and change and adapt, right? They're so malleable and fluid. And I think part of that is because they don't have much to hold on to. First of all, they don't have much power, right, over their own lives. Adults mostly direct their lives for them. And second of all, they don't have much history. So they haven't built up like hardened preferences and, a list of pretty big decisions. For the most part, for most children, life it's just constantly fluid. And so like that act of letting go of something and moving forward and making a personal change and kind of going with the flow and even growing is very natural to a child.
Well, and I also think that what that refers to, because there's also scriptures about when I was a child, I did things as a child and now I've put away childish things, right? Like, he's not telling us to be childish.
Right.
And I think that being like a child, the thing that most defines someone who is childlike is their dependence on an adult figure to provide for them and to guide them. And I think for me, it's more relational. Being like a child is relying on Christ and realizing that we depend on him, which sometimes comes from trying to do things ourselves, failing miserably, being humbled to the dust, and recognizing that we can't do it without him. And so we enter that childlike state of dependence in our relationship to him.
So what does that have to do with character? I'm not getting after you.
Yeah,
I
tangent.
think, well, it's not a tangent. I think that it's all relevant. I ask it because I think that there might be some good realizations, that could come from pulling these things together. Because, for example, that's not just our own personal religious worldview, but I think that understanding how human beings actually work and what is the nature of human beings is a good way to, the more knowledge we gain about that, the more we can accurately build and interpret and anticipate actions of characters. It makes us better writers. I think what you're getting at is, I think some people might have the worldview that's opposite. They might believe, no, we need to take control of our lives. We need to, and there might be some validity to that, right? It's this balance between sort of grace and agency, right? This ability and responsibility to act and make decisions versus this trusting that no matter what happens, we'll be okay kind of a thing. It's like difficult, almost at odds, something that we've listened to a guy named Jared Halverson talk about polarities, right?
Yeah.
Or Hegel's dialectical thinking kind of stuff.
Yeah, and I think at the core of all of this is sort of a question about how do we change? Is it that we are dependent and we can only change through Christ, or is it that we take hold of our life and decide to make positive change, or is it a combination of
Who is it up to?
things? Yeah, who
Yeah.
ultimately does that? I mean,
Well, but the reason I think what you're asking is so important, I mean, and you can toss it up and go, okay, these are difficult philosophical or religious questions, but what do they have to do with screenwriting? The reason I think it's actually important to screenwriting is because I think those are probably the two big worldviews on how do we change. Does it depend on something outside of ourselves or something inside of ourselves? If outside, what is it? And if inside, what is it? And the answer to that question has a lot to do with the way we write characters and the way we write stories and the way we tell stories and the way actors act characters and stories, right? And the way directors make choices about when to do another take and which take to choose in the edit. Like that worldview will affect the way you make movies. And so I think they're valid and important questions to ask ourselves and to ponder on, because it allows us to more thoughtfully decide which take to use,
or how to have a character
what
arc.
what to
Right.
say to an actor, what to write on the page. Yeah, all these things. And so right now, something I think you and I have talked a lot about is that, like, the capacity to change and to even use our agency to change is given to us by the grace of God. And yet the decisions we make are a result of our own wills. Like, we must choose to follow a path. And so that's the religious side of it. But from like a writing side of it, that means I'm going to, I believe that characters on the one hand are not necessarily a product of their circumstances, and yet circumstances have the byproduct of character, especially high intensity circumstances that draw a character out of people. I don't know if I phrased that in a way that made much sense, but
Well, they reveal the character, I suppose. But I guess in my mind, I'm kind of thinking of it right now as almost a simple algorithm or like a maze, that we're presented with decisions and we make choices. And often I think when I've seen characters in movies change, you see them make the same sort of choice over and over again and fail, fail, fail. And then they have to have some enlightenment at some point, some sort of a realization or a breakthrough that causes them to make a different choice. And then even often that seems like it fails, but ultimately it doesn't. And so there's sort of this like, yeah, you're taking action, you're making decisions, but we rely on that revelation or that inspiration to know how to make a better choice or what to do instead.
And maybe it's through additional information, like they get a little bit more, a bigger view of the puzzle, and they finally go, oh, okay, I'm going to change the way I approach this. Going back to Sound of Metal, I think it's interesting because he fights and fights and fights to reunite with his girlfriend and to reclaim his old life. And then he does reunite with that girlfriend and can immediately see by her behavior that them separating allowed her to experience some growth that she really needed, and that them coming back together, he realized was going to cause her to revert back to the same problems that she had been struggling with. And that revelation, that contrast, the experience that he had had through Act 2 of the movie, essentially gave him the perspective in that moment to be able to see, like, we served each other. The relationship served us to get us to a certain point in our lives, and now it's best that I let her go and walk away from this. And he couldn't see that in Act 1, and he wasn't with her in Act 2. And in Act 3, he finally is in a position with the necessary experience and perspective to be able to see that. And that's when you realize this character has grown. Like, he never would have walked away from her. That was like world ending for him in Act 1. That was, it seemed like it was going to destroy him, at least in his mind. And now that he's with her again, he's grown enough, learned enough, seen enough that he, like you said, makes a different decision in a similar circumstance.
Yeah.
And they do that very beautifully. And I'm not sure if you had thoughts or examples that were in your own mind, but I went back to the same one to illustrate the point.
I think there's tons of examples in my own life and in movies. I mean, we just watched La La Land, so that's fresh on my mind.
Again.
I know. I don't get tired of that one. And that's another example where she's trying the same thing over and over again, auditioning, trying to make it as an actress, going to events like parties, networking, and it's failing every time. It's not actually leading her to the success she wants. And then Sebastian, Ryan Gosling's character, comes into her life, and he's sort of the catalyst for a different approach, saying like, well, why don't you write something as interesting as you are? And he provides,
which is our advice to everyone listening to this podcast, but we'll get to that later.
Yeah, for sure. He provides for her to be able to quit her job and write one act play and do this play. And it feels like even that has completely failed, and the relationship fails, and no one shows up to her play, and she can't pay back the theater, and she's all sad. But ultimately, there was someone there who saw it and cast her in something big, and that was a big break for her. But it's sort of this, like, she was just going to keep trying the same thing forever if it hadn't been for Ryan Gosling's character stepping in and making some change there. And that was sort of like why their relationship was meaningful. Even though they didn't end up together, he helped her to see what she needed to do to achieve what she was trying to achieve. And so sometimes I think God works through other people. Sometimes he inspires us directly. And sometimes it takes us some time to actually like apply what keeps coming to us that we need to do, to believe that it will actually work enough to do it.
And I'm just going to throw this out here. If you're listening and you're thinking, well, like, what if I don't have the same like religious perspectives as you? I don't think it matters in the terms of the craft of screenwriting that you share our perspectives. I mean, it matters in whatever end goal you have for what you're communicating with those films, but those goals might be different. They're always going to be different for different people. We're all different human beings. But I guess my point is that I really believe that it's not a Deus ex machina kind of a situation where whether God's completely in control or not. I think that life itself was designed and set up in a way, and I think we kind of have to believe this whether we're religious or not, if we're screenwriters, that the nature of this world will always drive us to a point where what we hold dear is at stake, and we have to make decisions in the midst of those stakes. Like, it is just the way of life. It's why great stories work the way they do, and that's why I think those principles are universal.
Yeah.
And it's been the same since, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and Hansel and Gretel and
something
Star Wars and whatever,
Yeah.
plug it in. But like, people, life is about this journey that we're all on where we're having to make these choices, and at the end of many choices, we learn something. I mean, an example of a very small character arc is a exquisite film like Manchester by the Sea. I mean, it's not like he's like totally healed and made this huge arc by the end of the film. And yet you yearn for him, and he's dealing with a big, difficult circumstance, and he's trying to figure something out. And by the end, like, his growth is teeny tiny. I mean, it's not like, he pulls the sword out of the stone or anything. And yet the experience of watching that film still sucks you in.
Yeah, it's that whole something will always force us to face ourselves, our own weaknesses, our own fears. And even though we may try to run or hide from those, they keep appearing in different places until eventually we have to face them. We have to confront them in some sort of different way because there is no escaping.
Yeah. I've really enjoyed this conversation so far with you, Anna. I'm not sure if you want to keep pushing it farther and see where we go. Some things to recap, I guess, what we've learned so far. We talk about what is character. Let's it
Bring it back.
present similar circumstances that we began with in the first act of this podcast and present them at the end of the podcast by asking, how would you define character?
Well, did I ever ask you?
I mean, I think I talked to that point, but ask me.
Okay. Well, how would you define character?
I defined it. Well, I quoted Robert McKee as defining it as what someone does in high stress circumstance.
All right.
And I would say, I would ask, why do they do that? Why do they make that choice in the high stress circumstance? And the answer to that why, I think, is closer to what actually defines character. We define character for the audience by showing them what that character does in the high stress circumstance, but that's not necessarily what character is. What it is the reason why they make that choice. And the reason why they make those choices might be circumstantial, which you can show the audience. Like, oh, well, it's clear that he did that because his mortgage depended on it, or the life of so-and-so was on the line or whatever. But that just reveals, I think, their beliefs. So if anything, I would define character as, I won't say thoughts. I guess the word beliefs means thoughts that we believe are true. And so it has to be more than just an idea that the character has. It's the actual beliefs that the character holds, And I think that defines character. And before I forget, I'd like to tie that into something you actually said on our conversation for the podcast, which you mentioned Will Smith, who in an acting seminar, lecture,
Masterclass, yeah.
he talked about how character is a construct and how he realized this because he tried a little bit and he found himself becoming in real life that person. And he said it was kind of scary for him. And he realized at that moment, like, character in movies is a construct, but in real life, it's a construct. It's something we decide to create. And so it's interesting. And I won't go deep into the acting part of it, but this idea that, like, in reality and in screenwriting, in the art of creating characters, the beliefs we have, when we understand that is what is driving our decisions, we can analyze and reconstruct those beliefs. That can be hard work sometimes. And sometimes life forces us to reconsider our beliefs for better and for worse. But those beliefs that we choose, and sometimes maybe don't realize we chose, maybe we don't realize some of the beliefs that we have developed, especially the ones we've developed from childhood. But whatever those beliefs are, they exist, and those are what are driving our choices. And beliefs are especially manifest in high stress circumstances or high stakes circumstances.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that does apply, especially in filmmaking, just because filmmaking is a simplification of real life. It's a microcosm of, a whole person. And so it could almost be as simple as one particular thing that the character believes, or one particular aspect of their character, one trait that, and in real life, that's how we change, is one thing at a time, little changes at a time to little aspects of our character. It's not usually an overhaul of all of our attributes at once. We kind of have realizations slowly. We grow into them and change them. But it makes me think that if I were to write a character and try to develop them, I might focus on one particular aspect. An example that came to mind was The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. And how does he react in a high-stress situation? He imagines something like magical and adventurous. He imagines himself,
The way he wishes he was.
the way he wishes he could be in that situation, and actually zones out. It's like a protective way of escaping what is his reality and trying to run from his reality, which he eventually can no longer do.
Yeah, he starts to, like, his arc is sort of catalyzed by a decision to embrace the situation as it is and confront reality, which I think is really interesting. It makes me think about the beginning when he's trying to reach out to a woman on a dating website, when he actually has like an in the flesh sort of like relationship with this person at work, which they've never actually spoken to each other, but he's hoping that this was a better way somehow to connect with this person. And ultimately he realizes that the best way to connect with that person is like in the actual literal world. And so once again, that's an example of displaying arc. But those decisions, what are his beliefs? You don't spell them out in the screenplay, right?
Right.
And that would kind of ruin the art, right?
But my point is that it just focuses in on that one aspect of his personality, and we get some of the other aspects as we see it play out. But
they're not the fulcrum of the story, upon which everything.
There is a simplification of one aspect of his personality.
And maybe that's the delineation between character and characterization. Character is the beliefs or the beliefs that manifest themselves in the attribute that defines the arc of the story.
Yeah.
Whereas characterization is all the other thoughts and details about this character that are peripheral to that story.
Yeah.
But they still help us flesh out the character. It's important to kind of explore those things, but the most important part of that is that fulcrum, that core belief, which leads to that core change or arc. Perhaps this podcast is a simplification of the craft of character writing, but I think it's been a helpful reminder to me, the discussion of the key principles that help us to think about and approach and write and create characters. And if we can't do that, then we can't really tell stories, in my opinion.
Yeah, I've enjoyed it. I feel like I have some takeaways I want to go work on the story now. And thank you so much for listening with us. If you have thoughts, we'd love to hear them. We love hearing from our listeners. Feel free to send us an email or reach out if there are podcast ideas, topics that you want us to cover, or comments that you have based on what we've shared. We love that kind of interaction with you guys. So thanks for listening.
Thanks.
We'll see you.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us today. If you like what you're hearing on the podcast, you'll love the Feature Filmmaker Academy, a program designed to teach anyone how to finance and finish a feature film.
There are many resources teaching you how to do a great job, but what they don't teach you is how to get the job in the first place.
You cannot have a career making feature films until you've made at least one. Anyone can make a feature film using our proven model.
It's risk-free. If you follow all the steps in the program, you'll finance and finish a feature film, or we'll give you your money back.
Learn more at invisiblemansion.com/feature filmmaker or click the link in the show notes.
If you find this free resource valuable, we'd really appreciate it if you leave us a review or share it with another filmmaker. We'll see you next time. Bye. Bye.